Okay, hi everyone, welcome to the Open Grand Finals of NTU. Just a couple of reminders for the audience. Please don't speak loudly, put your phones on silent, you should know the drill. So all the relevant information is up on the screen. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the meeting.
Our stance today is extremely simple. As a collective, we don't want these restrictions in place. Otherwise, we believe that how NTU debates will not be able to get a job whatsoever. But more simply, we actually believe that these restrictions are artificial means of soothing our warranted emotive anxiety. And this anxiety, is something that does more good for economic prospects in the entire country and locals eventually. Firstly, a quick definition. We realize that in terms of quotas, we're looking at things like quotas in companies, like a next step of how many people you can hire who are not from your country itself, or a ratio, for instance, maybe only one foreigner to every 3 locals or something like that. Also, things like entry restrictions to their countries in terms of how they issue things like work visas, or number of big cards they're able to give out. We don't want any of that. What do we want to say? We realize that, of course, we're going to allow you to come in as long as you can get a job. But more importantly, firstly, our policy is to keep locals still employable, so we will not shortchange our locals. We will still have things like a good education system to make sure they come out with good certification and work skills. We will offer things as usual like skills upgrading, career consultation, state planning and kinds of things, and mutual education is relevant to the skills you need to survive in the workforce. Things like moderating wage expectations, things like helping older people to still stay relevant in the workplace, and also things like helping unemployed people to find jobs. Second part of our policy, we will still encourage interaction and assimilation between people who come in and work from overseas and locals. We will do things like create chances and channels for discussion and understanding between locals and foreign workers and talents. We will therefore do things like education campaigns, helping expats and families to get a local community. Basically, to humanize them in the eyes of the local community. On the start of the way, I have 3 points for you today. Firstly, I'm going to where government relies on the employability of local people. Secondly, on the necessity of foreigners coming in. And thirdly, on how essential the larger economic good for the country. So first of all, let's look at where government relies. And we believe that other sides will come on and tell us, the government duty is to protect the locals and to make sure they are employable in their jobs. We fully agree. But here is some nuance we want to put in, We don't think that government duty for this means that you have to go and reserve jobs especially for you. But rather, to make sure that you as a citizen are not shortchanged, that you are enabled to find opportunities and be able to qualify for them should you want them to do so. Why do we say so? Because we believe that keeping things meritocratic, keeping things such as because you are local, you take jobs for granted, is the worst way to make sure locals are able to keep out and find and stay skilled in the long run. But secondly, we realize, that if foreigners can come in and get jobs that are qualified, the reverse is true of our locals as well. What we are doing is to make sure our locals in developed countries are very much being able to seek work elsewhere. And they are, especially in developed countries. We finally agree some of the most mobile, most talented citizens. They have advantage in many different ways. They realize that the first language will be English, or something that is very much developed in many countries around the world. So we also realize that educational level is something that is very much rising. Become a more reputable schools, become a degrees that are highly certified. They have stable education systems, and they come with a great deal of social cultural capital. They are used to the right systems of operation, the right level of technology, the right exposure to things like industrialization and urbanization. And equipping them with these abilities is far better than just reserving jobs for you. Simply because that is what the global economy at the moment most prizes of you. And in the wider world, there are more diverse opportunities and experiences. They can be dreamt of in a single country. You think it's great to open no access to it as a citizen. Before I go on, yes.
The average American still can't get a job in a place like Brazil because they're always going to be more Brazilians who will work harder and will a lower wage at the same level of education.
Well, then we think it's time, for Americans to moderate their expectations and maybe to work a little harder. But it is odd for you that you're assuming straight away that your Americans are caught situation where they can never get any opportunities whatsoever. And that brings me on to my second point, on the necessity of foreign workers. I think it's very pernicious, to assume that in a country, in a developed country, Nobody is going to want to hire your locals. I'm going to put it to you, the locals still maintain a natural advantage from the start that cannot be learned and cannot be picked up by any foreign talent or worker that comes in. Why? They know local things like local networks, social networks, on the ground knowledge that they were born and bred with. They are also less likely as employers and outlook their lives here and go to different countries should they seek a job in their own land. It's also easy for them to fit into local culture and local corporate culture because the understanding the same reference in the fact they were locally educated from young. They don't need to believe, right? Locals are still very much employed. The question therefore lies, where do we really need foreign workers then? Only a few certain gaps that is highly desirable locals cannot fill. Obviously, it's things like your dirty, injurious, demeaning jobs that no skilled workers come into, like right citizens in developed countries not really wanting to. And we do need to bring in our foreign workers for that, right? Because they maintain the fundamental infrastructure and in the labor application. But more importantly, we realize that often skilled foreign workers bring experience from outside the country. They bring us in special language skills. They bring in things like specialized rare skills that we couldn't find within the country. Therefore, they are very much necessary instead. And they're here, right, not to steal your jobs, but to complement the local workforce. And therefore, build more future opportunities in industry for the local workers. But the more I realize, right, that the economics of developed countries are greater than the economics of our developed countries are greater and more diverse than you think. Economic trends are always changing. And when it happens, we gain a first mover's advantage. We bring in talented foreign workers to pave the way and build up new important industries. They will pave our new trends, creating more opportunities for local workers. Right? That makes me on to my very last point on how this leads to the larger economic good. Well, yes, we do believe that locals are more privileged. But in some small areas, they are preferred over other workers because of lower costs. Say, mid-tier service industries or express road coming attachments and obligations, and therefore they devote more time to your work. But that's how competition goes, right? We get locals bring more to the tables, but sometimes foreigners in the own set points. Individual firms can decide which competitive advantage they need for in the workplace instead of choosing any other candidate for a job. I think that's truly what makes works competitive. European nations should have the power of corporations for their own protection of locals. Because a competitive work is so much better for a country's growth, so much better for things like attracting investments, leading to a better state economy, which then benefits your locals in the long run. You also think it makes locals far more competitive because now they will stay ahead in the international workforce, international competitors. We therefore believe that when we set restrictions and prevent those assets from coming in, you lose all these economic benefits. They're so necessary for a developed nation to survive in a global economy. For all the things that we best boost competitiveness, we best help the locals in the long run. I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you. To start the case with all, I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition.
Let's recognize that generally we agree that on both sides of the house, if local workers can be employed, then we are fine with that. And therefore, a lot of the advantages that we talked about the advantages local workers have in being employable, apply on both sides of the house. So where does this debate take place? This debate takes place in the situations whereby local workers cannot be employed, and when we restrict foreigners from taking these jobs, local workers will be employed. And that's the scope of the debate in this motion. Right? So one point of contention into this debate, like the entire analysis of how governments help workers, so and so forth, we think that this is not mutually exclusive. On both sides of the house, governments have an incentive to help local workers be more employable. But what's the difference in both in the two sides of the house? On proposition side, they're not going to give companies an incentive to help local workers when they can get foreign workers at a cheaper wage. On the other hand, on our side, when we shape policies for foreigners, what this does is it creates a natural incentive for companies to better their local workforce, to give them better skills, to make them more suited to this company, because they recognize that this is the reality of the workplace under our side of the world. And let's also recognize that when you help local workers, it's more sustainable. Because these local workers are the workers, even if they shift job, they're more likely than not going to shift country. They're going to want to stay close to their home. They want to work close to their home. And for all these reasons, we think that on our side, companies have incentives to help local workers. Moving on to my positive material. I have 2 points of substantive. Firstly, on how this better discharges the governmental mandate and directly tackles their principles. And secondly, on how it reduces xenophobia and because the idea that we artificially soothe anxiety. First one, potential. How this better discharges the governmental mandate? I think it's no potential to recognize that the government's first duty is for local citizens because citizens are the ones who are voting for these governments over a moment and vote these people into power, and therefore governments inherit the mandate of the people we are responsible for.
Why do companies choose not to hire locals?
We suggest, as I've already told you, that companies in status quo can get foreign workers at cheaper wages. But we don't think that, like I'm not explaining to you now, why this isn't good for our citizens moving with right? I think even in non-group designations, there's a business social contract in which government owes certain duties to their own people, to their own citizens. And like we recognize that the bulk of this debate lies in the very large one of the cost benefit analysis, not taking matter of these policies. And on our side, we're going to be showing you why these policies are beneficial because it allows the government to better discharge the mandate with people, which is what governments should be about in the first place. And why is this the case? Right? We recognize that in status quo unemployment exists not only in the developing world, Mr. Speaker, but also in the developed nation, right? Like recovery in the USA stems largely from things like people leaving the workforce because they've been unemployed for over 99 weeks and don't think they'll get a job. Like skilled labor doing unskilled labor, like skilled labor doing unskilled jobs. Like these are reasons why the unemployment seems to be up. But actually we tell you that this is problematic because like we recognize that countries by and large want to increase the potential of the workforce, which means putting skilled labor in properly skilled jobs, in encouraging like people to not leave the labor force, but to continue being gainfully employed, not anything relevant in their own countries, right? And how do we directly address it? In my data, I told you that we encourage companies to create foundations for employment, structures that systemically enable our labor, train our labor, better our labor. Like for example, like job training, like grassroots campaigns to reach out to people. So the problem is about unskilled local labor being unsuited to these jobs. We fix them. And let's recognize that this is particularly because like these policies don't apply just to unskilled labor, but to skilled labor. Like we have a lot of foreign expatriates into our own countries, and these policies apply to them as well. So, like for example, like what we talked about, NTU people will not be able to find jobs in status quo because their skilled jobs are being taken by foreigners who want lower wages. No thank you. So, no thank you. Even and the challenge is this. Even if proposition proves some generic economic benefit, they need to prove why this doesn't outweigh the massive, enormous harm accrued to local citizens. And they have to prove why government should care more about other citizens and not the enormous harm done to local citizens. Right? And they need to contest the metric of how that affects unemployed citizens in status quo. This is very important. So thank you. Second substantive on how it reduces xenophobia and tackles what we talk about soothing inside the status quo. And let's recognize that like the context to reduce xenophobia depends largely on how well citizens receive certain messages. What am I talking about? I'm talking about how feelings and insecurities constitute the lens in which all interaction is filtered with foreigners. Right? When locals feel threatened by foreigners with regards to their jobs and their livelihoods and economic security, they continue to interpret all future interactions with foreigners through the lens of these fears and insecurities. They continue to view the foreigners as the enemy, as the other. Right? And we think that on our side, in comparison, the knowledge that the government is protecting our employment opportunities. Third, remove this festering unhealthy competitiveness. It makes local citizens feel more secure and removes this lens that creates the otherization of the foreigner. Because we demonstrate on side of opposition, we better discharge the governmental mandate with own people, it reduces xenophobia and toxic environment in status quo. It does more good with own citizens. I'm very proud of it.
Thank you for your speaker for his comments. Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Mr. Speaker, sir, a couple of questions in today's debate. Firstly, are these restrictions effective in incentivizing, as they claim, companies to hire locals? Secondly, is there principal government justification to do this policy to ensure full maximum employment? And I'll deal with xenophobia because Mr. Sanders especially points this out. When we discuss the fact that what this does, it simply vindicates xenophobic sentiments because now you put state policy behind those sentiments of racist and xenophobic individuals. We already see in this quote. Now, firstly, we think the biggest problem coming up here is that he basically completely ignored great design, right? All he simply said, and this is the reason why I asked my PY, the only justification they have for why companies hire foreigners is because they just simply are cheaper, ignoring the many other reasons that she provided. Everything else has to be protected. Why? Because it meant they misunderstand the reality of the situation. Right? There are many other economic reasons why we hire foreigners, right? A lot of them, for instance, bring about certain skills. So the experience from coming from their home country, for instance, if I'm a big MNC that seeks, for instance, say I'm a big MNC that seeks to go into the Asian market using foreign imports, I want to, for instance, hire Vietnamese because they go to the local markets there. There are interests involved. They never dealt with that. We think moreover, but they fundamentally, even if we were to buy this idea that foreigners are somehow cheaper, we think that is a wrong assumption in the first place. Why? Because the kind of foreigners that really are going to be competing at locals for jobs in developed economies are ones that are going to come with high skills often, right? Because we're not really talking about really skilled jobs, right? Something that we heard earlier, but there's already a gap in many developed countries, for instance, for things like construction work or domestic work, dirty, intermediate, dangerous jobs that locals don't want to do with their high levels of education and degrees. I think in those scenarios, given that the kinds of jobs that we get under competition, right, supposedly locals are doing jobs, our jobs already require high skills. Why are foreigners sometimes more expensive than they are and not necessarily cheaper as technically is? Because, for instance, increased cost prices like relocation fees. Right? When I have to pay, for instance, to ship all your goods over. Furthermore, I have to do certain things, like, for instance, if you aren't eligible to get public housing, like you are in Singapore, I have to fund for you to stay in private housing. I may require, for instance, relocation of your entire family, to put your children to international school. We think expats are expensive, but we think the reason why corporations choose to do this is because they believe there's an economic incentive to do so. We think, therefore, the converse, these sorts of policies will be often seen the restriction of foreigners, then we then see often then companies deciding there is not economically viable for them to Singapore because they can't, for instance, to these countries, because they can't get the skills requisite for them to be able to, for instance, move into the region. We think that's a bad thing in the long term. Because let's face it, the economy just isn't simply about one or few or even hundreds of local jobs. It's about, for instance, I think that's an important multiplier effect that they are more in MNCs and more direct investment comes into the country, right? The fact that even if you do bring in foreigners, those foreigners will still spend money. There's a multiplier effect when you do have, right, when you do investment in MNCs coming in. Why is it significant? We think it stimulates the economy on a macro level, and they never done. But it's a little discretion at the end of the day. And what they also said was, even if they feel that they need to get to the local population, bringing in companies allows us to increase the skills of locals because now we get trading on the job. Because now it is the corporations that now have a responsibility to ensure the skills of locals. We don't necessarily think they never proven that they had that responsibility, especially since earlier on they just said that it's the state's responsibility to ensure the employability and the employment of workers. Firstly, as we pointed out earlier, we think the state does not have a responsibility for the employment of workers, something that we want electrically never done, except simply certain they did have some to ensure employment. We think the state has a responsibility to ensure the employability. We think there's a big distinction there part of locals. Why? Because we think that often locals make the decision that despite them being employable, they choose not to be employed in this particular jobs. We think that there's a distinction in this particular case that's important. We think that they make their active choice sometimes to perhaps not leave the country to greener pastures. We think that's important. But we also think, furthermore, that skills are still available on our side anyway. With, for instance, if MNCs do come because they are attracted by the possibility of being able to get, for instance, cheaper or skilled labor within Singapore, we think they'll still probably hire locals because there are incentives to hire locals if they're coming to Singapore, maybe you want somebody who is in touch with the local culture. We think therefore there are possibilities, for instance, for locals not to move overseas. So by working in Nestle and Singapore, I for instance not move to Switzerland. We think the converse is also then true. So locals themselves are empowered with MNCs being attracted to come into countries as well. Now let's deal with the idea of xenophobia. Because what they come up with, they've said that this policy deals with rising xenophobia by basically pandering to these popular sentiments, that people are very upset that they're losing jobs. So let's respond to that by giving in to their xenophobia. We don't necessarily think that's true. Why? Because as we proved earlier, the xenophobic sentiments that they're taking away my jobs is uncalled for. There is clear justification for MNCs for foreigners being able to take your jobs. We don't think it's just simply because, for instance, I as a CEO of Shell simply have a preference for white faces. We think there's economic rationale that's perfectly legitimate. But furthermore, what we think in this particular situation is that when the state, the reason why these policies cause more harm than good is because they do vindicate the soft enemy. Why? Because when the state makes certain policies, we assume the state, for instance, has expertise that we as locals, as civilians, do not necessarily have. They acknowledge about, for instance, how business works, because they are supposedly the experts and they can plan for the direction of the economy. They know, maybe because of focus groups and so on, how businesses function and why they choose foreigners to do this. When this is created, when these policies are put in place, two particular narratives are vindicated. Firstly, that we draw lines between foreigners and locals in an even more institutionalized fashion. But furthermore, perhaps more perniciously, we continue the narrative that it is a zero-sum game between foreigners and locals. I think that's particularly bad. Given the possibility and given that the state adds weight and its voice of authority to this kind of discussion. Where previously you may have had nebulous xenophobia, people just felt a vague sense of discontent, for instance, about a lot of foreign faces in the trade. Now what you say is they can point to the state and say precisely, they are taking away our jobs. Precisely, they are undermining my culture. I think that's bad. We think it hurts them. We think that increases xenophobia. We are bad.
Thank you very much. PLO, please.
There are two very big problems with team propositions case. The first lies in unpacking the phrase. Many foreign workers are in trade, so most of us are familiar with this within a place like Singapore. What does this mean? It means proposition cannot get away with claiming the only foreigners empirically who are taking jobs in developed countries are the best, the brightest, with the most specific skills. This might be where the economic rationale is strongest, but companies don't follow the economic rationale of the economy as a whole. Empirically, in many developed countries, you do have foreign workers working in the service sector, like the Polish cashier at Paramount in the United Kingdom, or an individual working from Mexico who's working as a server at McDonald's or a restaurant. So even if the debate is about that specific group, this policy of having absolutely no restrictions prevents our ability, like stops us from discriminating. The areas where they are not economically beneficial, we have to let them in anyway. That's the premise of my first speaker's case, not just. Second, key recognition. Think about their case for a moment. It's basically most locals will be hired. We want most locals to work locally. We just want a small sliver, the tiny gap that we talked about, to be plugged by foreigners. How is this mutually exclusive policy? This is the status quo. The status quo acknowledges that the gap exists. We control the size of the gap, and we dictate who should belong in this gap by using restrictions to screen for the types of specific specialized skills that they want. Think about why when we give up visas to select individuals, because we acknowledge that they have specific skills to do a specific job, hence we give them that job visa. So once again, the case sounds awfully similar to the status quo, and the status quo in many developed countries is the policy that we set for. That's what my first video is told. In lieu of this, two rebuttals. First, when duty calls, what should we do? Number two, how we fight xenophobia. Last argument is going to be why this is better for the countries, like developing countries, because of these individuals come from. When duty calls. Now, when does duty call? As we told you, there are specific situations where, despite the nuances that the proposition is talked about, there are simply too many foreigners, and locals don't have the requisite skills at a certain point of time to get a job. At the very least, we don't shoot ourselves in the foot. Why does this happen? Think about it. It's not just the case that we are giving you the skills for employment and as they claim, we have no duty to give you a job. There's an active harm to opening up your country to many foreigners. Every foreigner that comes in with a green card or with a visa is a foreigner who you intend to take a job from a local citizen. There is a zero-sum game. So if you think on one side, the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore should be training local citizens, while on the other, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs be creating an even more liberal immigration policy that makes the job of the Ministry of Manpower that much harder. There's a tangible trade-off that needs to be made because it makes the policies on your side less effective. So at the very least, if you acknowledge there's a duty, one way by which we make our people more employable and give them a basic standard of employment is to have some restrictions in the areas where they can currently perform these jobs. Second of all, where is the mutual exclusivity lies in the notion of specialized skills. So the second speaker, they essentially made the case about these specific skills, like knowing the Chinese region, knowing the Asian region. These seem like pretty easy skills to justify, which means that as long as we have a smart, restrictive policy, which is what my first speaker told you about, it is incredibly easy for us to put these individuals within the band of restriction. Where's the difference? The difference is that we don't think companies should be the one to decide this on their own. Companies should not have the freedom to say, I think this skill is pretty unique. I don't think any of the local citizens can perform this job. Because sometimes they can. The alternative to bringing in a Chinese citizen is to send one of your locals to work at a Chinese branch. Thank you. And able to pick up those skills and culture. It might be more costly, but in terms of its social value, ensuring the duty to maintain employment outside is better. So the government and the state should be the one that decides where employment goes. And when we do need to screen, the state should be the one doing it, not the companies of the country doing this on their own freedom. So the comparative is very simple. Outside promises more employment, we fulfill our duty better, we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, we create a more consistent economic policy. Second issue, the perception of xenophobia. Now here there is essentially a deadlock, because Rebecca says this vindicates people, because it makes them feel like, yeah, the racists are right, they are taking our jobs. But on the other hand, as we told you, what often happens is that not doing anything makes people give up in the government and feel like the government is leaving them at the mercy of people in general. So how do we break this deadlock? We posit that interaction can be a beneficial thing, but the interaction must happen in a good way. The good premise of interaction is in knowing that you're in control, that foreigners aren't coming to your country because they're forcing themselves upon you, that they're here because they were proved up, because they're bringing a value to society. This provides you with the safety net and the confidence to interact with people in a way that is not malicious or suspicious. So control is important. I'll take you in a moment. This is how we break the deadlock. This policy of restrictions gives people the illusion of control, even if that's all it is. And it's worse, it's still the illusion that the government is taking care of you. And as a result, this forces more positive round of interactions to break xenophobia. Outside breaks this deadlock. Go ahead.
If you want to know what talent they need can decide, and governments don't have to grant local jobs, then you abandon those both economic and factory resources. What's your calculus for this restriction then?
Oh, that's very simple, right? There's some companies who are trying to bring in workers when locals can do these jobs. You would use restrictions so that companies can't bring in these foreigners. Companies might have legitimate grounds on which to bring workers in if they have unique specialized skills that are irreplaceable. In these situations, government restrictions, it's a restriction, it's not a complete ban on foreign workers. So restrictions can accommodate it, by allowing these specific skills individuals to come in, as long as they can justify their skill set to the government rather than a company level in of themselves independently, because they have absolutely no duty to them. Okay, last argument. Why this makes things worse for the countries we developing countries, the people of developing countries. Many people in developed countries, many university graduates in developed countries come from developing countries. Often they're ones that are poached immediately while coming out of university. This is a bad thing. Many times we have funded their education as a developed country with the implicit understanding we're doing this to help the developing world. So for instance, we explicitly say, if you're coming from a poor African country, let me offer you a scholarship because this is like spreading information and doing good things in the world. What happens on the other side? It just allows like lots of these individuals to be poached by big firms immediately after coming out of university. This kind of like breaks any understanding in one's head, right? And I think it was a comparative. They do far less good in developed countries, whereas they themselves say there are already many people with graduates at like high levels of education. If with these restrictions, the vast majority of them would return to their home countries, but they'll still get pretty good decent jobs. But more importantly, their university education, their expertise and their skills will be best put to use. They'll do far more good in developing countries simply because that marginally there are less of them there. So it makes sense from our perspective, as well as the perspective of developing countries, to encourage this to happen. That's how being a developed country and an information-based economy with a good education system is. That's how you pay the debt back to the world. Outside is better for employment, outside is better for xenophobia, outside is better for the world at large. I am so proud of those.
Thank you very much. We'd like to invite Whip of the government.
After an extremely confusing opposition, who on one hand had a principle and then conceded it in the same speech, and then reified the same principle again a few minutes later, we don't really know what opposition wants to go for. We're going to do two things in this speech. One, what is government mandate and what are duties of corporations when it comes to hiring or providing employment? Second, can locals compete under that paradigm and how does xenophobia and social constructs fit into that? So let's start with what is government mandate and in comparison what are duties of corporations. We told you that government mandate was twofold, and it's not just about allowing individuals to have money on a daily basis. It's two things. One, to help locals be empowered and compete for themselves. Training to make them worthy of their own choices, to be able to compete with these foreigners that constantly apparently are stealing their jobs, and to actually be worthy in their lives of one to have those areas. Two, the development of the country's economy and industry, the development of corporations so that you can build more opportunities and more jobs, because more companies want to come into your country and more job opportunities open when you allow for an industry to flourish, when you allow for opportunities to open up. And it needs to balance both of these things and cannot ever suggest that only one of these things is more important than the other. We do not think that states have the ability to decide for themselves that these particular industries or all particular industries have some sort of gap that they understand and that they are going to restrict. The case is different from oppositions. We think the state cannot have any ability to judge what this gap is and how to make smart restrictive policy. Why? Because companies are the only ones who know what their roadmap is. They know what their expansion is. They know how they attempt to change themselves, how they make policies, how they intend to diversify. We think that industries develop based on entrepreneurial and innovative ideas that companies create for themselves and not based on what states decide. In fact, states should not decide the trajectory of industries and companies because you don't allow for economies to develop in the same way. You think that's hugely important, especially in a country where you want a diversification of industries and you want a diversification of economies to allow for that kind of opportunities to create. So we think the government mandate should not be to decide what those want better employees and they want the ability to create better opportunities. We think that the corporations do need obviously a profit margin incentive, and they obviously want to ensure that they hire the best employees for that particular job in the ability to ensure that their productivity is at its highest. So no, we don't think that corporations have more of an incentive under opposition's paradigm to ensure that there is better training or better skills for its employees. In fact, it's probably better on our side. The next thing then is this strange last idea from the next speech about scholarships and the ASEAN scholarship program in Singapore, basically, that says we allow individuals to go back to their home countries and return to help their own countries. Look, honestly, side government's policy really had nothing to do with helping any other country. We don't care. It's not about helping India develop its economy, and it's not about helping any other country want to solve its problems. It's about developing our economy and developing our industry. And obviously, we want to keep these people here because they're smart and they're good at what they do. And we want them to be here rather than go back to their own country where we lose the very talents that we spent 4 years in NTU training them for. We don't want these individuals to go back. We want them here so that they help develop the very industries that they are able to help build our own economies. So no, we don't think the government mandate is fulfilled better under their paradigm. When then are locals able to compete? It makes absolutely no sense for them when you come up here and say, well, you know what, there are some situations like service industries where companies choose to hire foreigners. Look guys, McDonald's has no incentive to bring in a Polish guy to serve rather than hire a local. They obviously have a specific niche to want to bring in a foreigner to fill in a gap that a local can't fulfill, because we think that locals have their own advantages within companies, right? They have contextual knowledge, they have stability, they possibly have equal qualifications and possible equivalent abilities. Their argument for suggesting that foreigners are taking our job is in a context where foreigners come here on their own first, and then after that find jobs on their own. It's not about companies that have restrictions on the number of foreigners they can get. We think that in fact these are individuals who help our economy just as much, and these are individuals who should continue to be given those opportunities to help develop our economy and industry. We think that if corporations choose foreigners over the local employees, there's a specific need or specific niche that they feel these individuals are fulfilling. Why? Because foreigners are not cheaper. They are not in any sense cheaper for a corporation. When you have to relocate individuals to from a completely different country, relocate their family, give them proper opportunities, put them in schools, we think that's in fact more expensive than having to pay for a local that has built his schools, that has his stability, it has its own home, it has its own education. We think in fact that if you do choose having, it's far more expensive to take in a foreigner. But then let's look at mobility before that show.
An average mid-level worker doesn't get a condo or relocation fee. Companies hire these people because ultimately the cost of the 10 years of their salary is going to be lower than a local.
No, you're going to bring in a foreigner into this country to take a job from a citizen that's already here. You have to give them the ability to survive in this context, right? So the standard of living or the cost of living is the same for the foreigner that comes here. So you have to give them the equal salary that you give to the local in order to survive. So no, it's not cheaper for the foreigner. Let's not look at mobility in general, right? We think that when you're in this globalized world, our locals are mobile. They can go overseas. They can go find jobs in other areas. That's why you have an advantage, especially when you come from a developed economy, that you have the average citizen you are above the average citizen of a developing economy, right? Better education, healthcare exposure to industrialization, urbanization, and a huge market of development in a lot of developing economies means that you have the upper hand in moving to a different country and finding equal jobs, meaning you're still competitive and you're still able to do it. The government mandate to ensure that employable is the same. Nothing has changed. Lastly, then, we think that xenophobia at the end of the day is problematic. Why? Because the interaction that's built on control in every speech literally suggests that locals should or would only have discourse when foreigners are second class or choose to be different from you. We think that kind of control in discourse is problematic and detrimental to the kind of discourse that we want to build a society, because xenophobia discussions need to be held when people are equal and on the same platform, and we do that when they compete on an equal and level playing field.
Thank you. We now like to invite the web of the opposition here.
Here I got our case confusing, so okay, simplify. Observation. There are many local-born citizens who are unemployed in their home country. Hypothesis number one, locals don't want to be employed, implied by the letter. Unlikely, because we told you people generally like jobs. Even if they don't like the jobs available to them in the specific industries that are open, they will usually like a job to available. So this hypothesis seems unlikely. Second hypothesis, locals want jobs, but they are outcompeted by foreigners. If the foreigners work there, they would then have those jobs. So if this hypothesis is true, then we suggest the more likely of the two hypotheses. Restricting the hiring of foreign workers would allow locals to be employed, and crucially, restricting the hiring of foreign workers just enough to allow locals to be employed without causing other damage. So, given that the second hypothesis is more likely, let's ask, should we do this, and whether this has benefits to society? But before that, a couple of wash points. They said locals can get employed in the first speaker. They said foreigners are valuable, and if it was for the niche. Right? So, aside from that, this is factually untrue. Like foreigners do compete in industries that are not niche. It's really niche. Like in food and beverage, it's really niche. And then, like, if it was really that foreigners are very valuable, and only those niches, it's very unlikely that there will be restrictions on the hiring of foreigners in these niche areas. Presumably, that's not where the debate takes place, because then there will be no added benefit to these restrictions. The best case they could possibly apply is the reason why restriction exists, even when it doesn't benefit anyone, is because people are cynical. It's okay that investment time is cynical. We'll get that. So one, should we do this? Government duty. The idea coming from government, we don't have a duty to reserve a job for you. We just have a duty to ensure that you're not short-changed the job, or as we phrase it, we want to empower you to make choices. Okay. Simply asserting a nuance does not make it true. We contest this nuance on a simple fact that regardless of why you are unemployed, harms occur to you if you are unemployed, whether you are justly unemployed or not. There is no such thing as unjust unemployment to begin with. So, given that as Kenneth put it in the beginning, states owe a first duty to their own citizens, and given that massive harms accrue to their own citizens when they are unemployed, thank you, we suggest that regardless of why you are unemployed, there is a harm that the states are justified in protecting you against. So the nuance suggests really makes no sense at all. I think it is a certain nuance that connected with any foundational principle. The other principle idea we talked about is that companies have rights. And again, we said this all from the start, like the rights of companies are probably subservient to the rights of individuals. Governments do make decisions that control the rights of some people, maybe to protect people from direct harm. The right of a company is any to a bit more economic benefits, probably outweighed by the massive harms of unemployment that occur to a single individual. Harms of not having a home to live in, not being able to care for their children. So, given that massive harms to individuals are right, and the first figure is both sides agree, is to make sure that people don't get employed. We suggest that even if there were other methods to get people employed, this is a legitimate tool for government to use. But we transit out to the second point, this is actually good for society. So the first question is, which side better help locals achieve that level of employability? So we need to analyze two factors here. Number one, company side analysis. So we suggest that even if you manage to treat local on your side with government methods to make them as employable as foreigners, companies are still more likely to choose foreigners than they are to choose locals, including this first and second. Why? It's not just because they compete on the basis of wages, but because traditionally you've always hired foreigners. They are a reliable labor supply. You trust them more. There are stereotypes associated with which kind of people are doing what kind of job. And these stereotypes affect hiring practices. So you are systemically more likely to hire a foreigner, even if they compete on the playing field. So why is the outside changes this thing? Because when we cut off supply foreigners, you will have to employ a local, unlike what efforts we learned from employees. So, because of this, you shift the incentives of companies to employ these individuals. Furthermore, we need companies to be on board, because companies can provide specialized training, which they are aware of, to individuals that actually enable them to qualify for these jobs in the first place. So, on the comparative of which side help people from one side. But secondly, we are also going to suggest that employees are more likely on our side to want these jobs and actively seek them out, because there is an overriding perception that foreigners are people you want to hire. You have a million that jobs to always be out. We find this all the way first. There's insecurities that are not in an individual who wants to be hired. So by breaking the perception that only foreigners can do these industries, make it more likely people will go for these training programs in the first place and therefore achieve that level of employability. So on our side, we make it more likely that people can be helped. This is a marginal benefit. But second, consumer profit is a huge point because except this, like if the government is going to tell us that the reason why restrictions exist, even when it has more economic good, is because of xenophobia, and that depends entirely on which side fixes xenophobia. This is super important. Before I deal with it, yes.
If companies traditionally only find foreigners reliable to hire, why is the likely counterfactual that corporations will now hire locals instead of just going to another country where there are freer hiring policies?
Because some companies are small and medium enterprises that can't move overseas so easily. Like, not all companies are major MNCs that we're talking about. We are talking about the past portion of SMEs who will act in each country. So moving on, like xenophobia. So we both accept that xenophobia will happen to some extent in some class. And we accept that with all message standpoints and debates, the value of the message we receive depends on the lens of which the viewer receives this message. So which side creates the worst lens that creates more? We told you they create a lens of insecurity, which changes the way locals interact with foreigners. They told us that we create state planning. Okay, so we're going to suggest the first lens, much more how to learn the second lens. And Kenny did tell you this in his speech, because the insecurities of risking losing a job hit directly to you. It might hurt you as a person. It means that you feel personally threatened by this individual who is a foreigner. You feel personally threatened because the children might go hungry as a result of this your job. So the lens which they create is far more powerful than any state narrative which they might create in contrast. We might create, like, who honestly cares, right? Like, oh, so government setting this policy. I guess that means, like, since governments are gods, like, we must find this narrative. But one narrative is just far more impactful and personally relevant. So on their side, they have a personally relevant narrative of the offensive foreigner who threatens to steal my job away. We break this by asserting that one, from this transfer of view, we curtail them and outcompete locals, and therefore we fight xenophobia better. They can't actually break this law. So that's why we think the lens they create is far, far worse. Finally, on developing countries, they simply asserted that they don't care about harm to developing countries because this is a debate about government duties. Wrong. This is a debate about harm versus good. So, like, if we can prove that the net utility to the world is diminished by that policy, and we haven't taken this as standard, the logic was unrebutted because they hurt developing countries, and that is a net harm of their side of the house. So we have a net good, like suggested by encouraging foreign workers to move home instead of allowing this massive brain drain problem to happen. So on all these counts, is it good for us to put restrictions? Yes, it is. We help locals, we fight xenophobia, and we allow developing countries to flourish. For all these reasons, we must oppose.
Thank you. To close the debate for the op bench, I'd like to invite the op live speaker.
In a perfect world, if every company acted as was good for the greater economy, then perhaps team proposition outcome would be good. As we said again and again, this outcome is that only the specialized skills, only those who need to find employment in the developed world with those specific regional skills will make it. Everyone else will be specially cut out by companies who will not hire them in the first place. The thing about running an argument as specific as this is that sometimes companies just don't get it that precisely right. And the status quo bears this out. A quick sweep through developed countries suggests that the people who are working in the developed economy who are foreigners are not in that country. Are not just those with specialized skills, are not just with skills that are irreplaceable. The vast majority of them still end up in mid to low level jobs. Or even then, some of them are permanently replaceable, even if they are skilled. And so the case of team opposition was also very simple. Rather than expanding this disparity between what we need and what we have, it's a better thing to close this gap by using restrictions in an intelligent, careful, and considered way. By the end of this debate, we're still not sure what this principal inconsistency in uses of is. But even if you want to talk about it in reply, we suggest that economics is sometimes contradictory. Economics is not about holding to any one principle, it's about creating moderation. And that's what our side stood for from the very beginning. What does our side stand for? Three main things. Number one, we stand for fulfillment of your duty as a government. That is not trite in the sense of we will give you skills and you can make your way on your own. Many governments are actively trying to help their people in the development to climb out of economic recession desperation. Because it's not enough to tell people, here you go, help yourself. Especially when your policies in terms of letting every single foreigner in, not just those who find desirable, any single one who wants to come in can come and look for a job. This actively hurts each and every one of your citizens that is trying to compete in that job market. It is a zero-sum game, and your actions on one branch of government do directly hurt the ability of another branch to execute that duty. So it's not enough to just say there is a nuance, hence there is a distinction. Outside doesn't believe that locals must go overseas to find a job. Outside doesn't believe that they have to scrape their way through and take low wages in order to find that same mid-level service job. We believe duties are about far more balanced middle ground. Sure, you have to reserve jobs for them to be like completely on target, but you must at least give them a reasonable shot of doing so. And this policy creates some reasonable model middle ground. Next point we want to notice in our case is that we recognize that companies will change their behavior outside the house. When foreigners are no longer the easy option by virtue of their lower price, and the fact that you can offer them a lower wage because they don't have a family even to pay for their housing, they live in temporary houses, etc., stuff we told you. When this option is denied to them, it means it makes far more sense to tap on your local housing pool. And that means the incentive to invest in this talent in the long run, in making sure that there are more permanent jobs, company loyalty, and so on and so forth. So outside is far better because we get companies to move away from their addiction of using foreigners where it's not needed. That's what our policy has been about. We think it will change companies' incentives. Far better. The third and final part of this debate is about xenophobia. And once again, we broke this debate from the start. At some point, right, the xenophobia argument is going to come to a wash. Both sides of the house is going to claim that they change behavior. Most important thing sometimes is a symbolic act, the lens by which you view the other. Outside has argued that it's far more important to target this lens than to change the other itself. Because as they argue, if foreigners can bring those benefits to us, what we want is for our locals to see the power of those benefits without feeling intimidated by those harms. And the best way to do this is to create a position of security through a policy that ensures and promises your local citizens that you will not be thrown to the dogs in a haphazard and uncontrolled way. At the end of this debate, guys, team opposition is not anti-foreign. Some of us want to study overseas, some of us intend to work overseas. What we are against is a haphazard and uncontrolled policy of allowing any single foreigner, regardless of whether what kind of job they'll find and how they'll earn your people, from entering the country. Outside is mutually exclusive. It's far more precise. It's far more targeted.
Thank you. To close the debate, Dr.
In true roles in Singapore fashion, there are two roles. The first role is that of our side, where we believe that our government operates on two key compasses. Firstly, an economic compass. Our government realizes there is a whole plethora of reasons why a firm may hire a specific candidate. It depends on things like skills, what each firm may want at a specific point in time, how well someone may fit into the firm culture, or the cost of hiring this particular person. In other words, the firm needs to look at how it can value everyone seeking interviews once. We want to prove to you through this, that firms really know this, and every one of these criteria really matter. Therefore, that's why we told you that foreign workers come in for things like the low-skilled jobs that nobody wants, or because they have special skills to present to you, or to set up new pathways, new industries that will benefit your people. In number one, I think they complement what firms can get here in terms of manpower. It's a necessary complement. And the ones I told you, there was never really that way. But we're telling you, yes, firms have needs and they know how to use those needs best. That's why we tell you that our government's economic calculus is so much wiser. We let firms have a choice. We let firms do the thing because we realize it's what truly creates a competitive workforce, increases investment, and also creates a good economy. This is what any responsible government should do. People's interests. In my case, I cannot employ you, but the government's duty or care is to reserve jobs for people who deserve it, but to enable that all workers are employable, making an asset not only locally but internationally. A nuance that was completely ignored throughout the case until David came out randomly with some new method. If you want to say no, we have always hired foreigners. No, that's not very true, right? And we don't really see any real counter reasons to counter my extensive analysis and my characterization as to why locals are still desirable. He also came out and told you that locals don't apply now because they feel inferior and undesirable, which really makes no sense, right? Because then where do they go? Did you see at the very start of the speech, that locals really want any job to begin with, so we don't understand all that they do. But anyway, you realize that Aggro also came out and told you that what they are doing is use the state voice to vindicate things as an award, something to stop. We also came and told in our policy that we keep our locals employed, and that's why we are the ones that keep the calculus of what our people need in terms of social harmony and also economic well-being. So what we have to tell you, right, is basically our government is the one that should unite these two concerns and do necessary calculuses. We make sure our people can get jobs. We make sure our community is together. It is not crop price at the moment. And lastly, we also make sure that where local individuals might not be able to get their first trusted jobs is for the greater good of a stronger economy which benefits the whole country. Because what is government for? If you want to consider the big picture, what is best for the larger population. Next thing on then to Diablo. We realize that Diablo is the one that's the full calculus, the economic calculus, and the people's interests completely clash and destroy each other, creating an economic calculus instead. That's quite cool things they brought to us. We came up with what government did. Kenny came up first and said, we don't want to make people angry, just give them jobs. But we really overprotection is not the way to go, something they ignore. But they really came out and told you, there's no duty to give them jobs. Our concern is too much immigration hassle. Not only is that making no sense, it considers this first case. Last thing came out and also a reverse brain drain, which are false benevolence, right? That assumes that your workers in developing countries still have jobs at home and will not benefit their homeland when they experience in firms in developed countries. But anyway, that makes no sense. Because the thing our government mandated is for their own developed country in the long run. So basically, this entire mandate point fell apart by itself. But again, at its best, right? We think what they are doing is to abandon the economic calculus of creating the best economy for people, and to abandon the calculus of people's interests, only caring about what makes them feel good, without regard of what helps their economy in the long run. Therefore, they came to us to prove harms versus good. We had, but I'm going to go one step further. Under their economic calculus, there is only harm in place for the country. Therefore, we'll lift the policy restrictions I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank all of the speakers in the case. Please step up.
Thank you.